we're going to have Rowen White back with us and Liz Carlisle, and I know they've spoken a little bit and have a dialogue for us. And so I will let y'all take it from here.
Thank you so much, Dan and Rowen. It's just such an honor to be in dialogue with you. I wanted to pick up a thread from your keynote this morning, and I really appreciated your reminder that grains and really all seeds are gifts, gifts of the land and gifts of Indigenous seed stewards, and that like all gifts, they come with reciprocal responsibilities. And so I wonder if you might help us think a little bit about what those responsibilities are, and specifically a couple of terms that you brought into the conversation that I wanted just a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit more about these terms, and maybe if you can give an example. Indigenous seed benefit sharing and also seed rematriation.
Yeah, absolutely. Deeply appreciate being here to think a little bit more about that reciprocity. I mean, I think we need to think there's layers of reciprocity when it comes to seeds. You know, we are bound inextricably into a reciprocal relationship with plants, especially the ones that have been domesticated. And so each and every seed variety that comes down through a lineage of stewards, with it comes agreements from those original stewards of that seed down the line. And I think in some way, in this current industrial food system, a lot of those responsibilities and agreements have been abdicated. You know, the responsibility to care for seeds as relatives, as well as just seeds and their provenance, like where are these seeds coming from, and what are those agreements? I just think we need to have more conversations about that, especially as we want to. I think a lot about a culture of belonging in our food system. I think it's really important for us to think more in depth about that. Wendell Berry oftentimes says, we exploit what we merely value, but we defend what we love. And I think bringing that sense of relationality back in is critical. And so, again, I think in working interculturally, you know, we know that seeds move through migration patterns and have moved all across the globe in beautiful ways. You know, I think a lot about the time I was in Italy and I was visiting with a corn farmer just outside of Venice. And I swear to you, he would swear on his life that corn had been in Italy since the dawning of their time, and that they, you know, had forged such a beautiful relationship with that particular corn. And it was a flint very similar to the flint corns that my people carry. It was an 8-road flint. And so I know that seeds naturally move, and with them come layers and layers of history, agreements and meaning. But I think we do need to create a culture, you know, continue to cultivate a modern version of that culture where people appreciate the generosity of a seed, the lineage and provenance of a seed. And how can that be carried through the distribution networks through which seed flow? We're working with a lot of seed companies, as I said, to really look at the lens in which they write seed descriptions, the ways in which they're contributing language and stories, those intercultural stories of that stewardship chain, and how can we, again, continue to give attributions where they're needed, especially in the public domain and in the seed commons. You know, we have a vision of Indigenous peoples that we would be able to safely share and trade seed in the seed commons, but unfortunately we live in a time where we don't all have the same value system of what happens when seeds flow outward from our hands. And so we're in a deep and nuanced conversation with people who want to approach seed stewardship from an ethical place, of really working with Indigenous communities and places where our seeds have gone outward and are enjoyed by many people. And so I guess the first piece is that I'll just touch a little bit on the aspects of what Indigenous seed benefit sharing can look like, some specifics. We've been working with Fedco Seeds, has a really innovative approach. They've approached it a little bit in like a royalty approach, which I think is, for a lot of breeders and a lot of people in the seed industry, it's a model that has worked. for individual breeders, but as Indigenous communities, we don't necessarily see that we have individual proprietorship over seed as like a farmer or seed keeper, that it's actually a collective inheritance, right? That we have this relationship and responsibility to those seeds. So what FEDCO has done in the last few years is initiated this Indigenous, I think they call it the Indigenous Royalties program, where any variety that's in their seed catalog that has provenance from Indigenous communities in North America, proceeds from those varieties actually go right back to those communities to support their food sovereignty efforts. And I think it's been a really beautiful thing to see that unfurling. And I think a lot of other seed companies have taken note and perhaps done other things in that same vein. I know Grand Prismatic Seed in Salt Lake City, which is a small seed company, they're working directly with the Dene people. There's a Utah-based conservation effort by the Dene or Navajo people, and proceeds from some of their seeds are going back to support them. I think, you know, we're trying to get away from it being completely transactional. We're working with like High Mowing Seeds. They're tithing back some of the proceeds from the Roy's Calais flint corn, which was an Abenaki variety, to the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which then goes to support Abenaki Indigenous agricultural revitalization. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can work together cross-culturally, but I think, again, it's important to remember it's not just transactional, that it's relational. So how are we being good neighbors to one another? How are we being good allies in supporting the agricultural efforts and seed keeping efforts of the first peoples of the land in where we live? And I'll just go a little bit into sort of the next layer of that, which is this concept of rematuration. Many of you perhaps have heard the word repatriation, which is when perhaps funerary objects or sacred objects or ancestral remains are returned back to a community of origin from perhaps a museum or a university. What we have found is that, again, seeds travel from hand to hand, from culture to culture. And when the first settlers came here, a lot of seeds were exchanged between Native people and the settlers that came here, some by theft, but oftentimes a lot by choice. There were also mutually beneficial relationships that happened between settlers and Native people. One fascinating story in that realm is looking at the legacy of Oscar Will and George Will and the relationships that they had with the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people. We actually have somebody in our network who is the descendant of some of the original people that Oscar and George in North Dakota were trading seed back and forth with. There was a woman named Scattered Corn, and her son was named James Holding Eagle. And we actually have one of their descendants is Jamie Holding Eagle, who is a part of our Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. And I actually had the opportunity, because I serve on the board of directors at Seed Savers Exchange. I got to meet Hank Will, who is a descendant of Oscar Will and George Will, at one of our conferences and campouts. And in his presentation, he was talking about the work of his ancestors and had mentioned Scattered Corn and James Holding Eagle. And I was actually able to reunite Hank with Jamie Holding Eagle. And there was some rematration of some of those old seeds from Hank's ancestors going back to the three affiliated tribes through Jamie Holding Eagle. And so, again, rematriation is often a cross-cultural relationship building where seeds that have been gifted or have traveled outside of Indigenous communities and perhaps have landed in places like the USDA GRIN Seed Bank or Seed Savers Exchange. We've been working with the Field Museum. We've been also working with University of Michigan and some other university entities to places where those Indigenous seeds have ended up. How can we build relationships between those non-Native entities back to Native communities and facilitate the bringing home of those seeds? It's a beautiful, I think, embodied act of reconciliation and reparations. I also think it begins a really beautiful dialogue of recognition of the contributions that Native peoples have made to agricultural projects that perhaps have happened outside of those Native communities. And it's also deepened into conversations around land rematration, ways in which farmers could perhaps tie back or give back land to Indigenous peoples. We work with the Pawnee, and they're actually were forcefully relocated out of their traditional homelands in Nebraska along the North Platte River. They were relocated to Oklahoma into Indian Territory over 150 years ago. And just in the last 15 years, one of my colleagues, Deb Echohawk, and a number of Pawnee people have reconnected with descendants of settlers in Nebraska, and they're working on a beautiful land and seed rematriation project where they're bringing those Pawnee seeds from Oklahoma, where they haven't really thrived because they haven't been very regionally adapted there, and are planting them back in those Pawnee homelands. And so I think there's a lot of hope in the stories. We're actually going to be publishing a action guide on how to get involved with seed rematriation work, as well as a short video. We've been the work that we've been doing at Indigenous Seed Keepers Network as a thought leader and somebody who's really helping to move the seed rematriation idea forward has been recognized on an international level with seed banks such as CIMMYT and other places where they're looking at the seed rematriation model as a sort of participatory conservation model that helps get seeds that have landed in seed banks back to those farmers of origin. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
Amazing. And I'm trying to remember that story about the Pawnee land rematriation. Isn't there also an element where part of that land rematriation was also stopping a major oil pipeline from going through that land?
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And there's been beautiful efforts for farmers in the Nebraska region to actually gift land back to both the Pawnee and the Ponca people. So.
Yeah, I wonder if I might just follow on that by asking, when you are getting to know a seed or a variety that's new to you, maybe didn't come from your own lineage, what are some of the first questions you ask? So I guess I'm sort of asking, like, how do you start developing a relationship with a seed or rebuilding some of those relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been working with our group a little bit with the Indigenous seed benefit sharing on this, especially with the companies who are interested in asking questions like that. We talk a lot about origins accountability and just transparency around that. So I think a lot of the times we also work at Seed Savers Exchange because they have seed historians, which is like such a great job, like I love that title, like to be seed historian, and they have multiple really amazing seed historians at Seed Savers Exchange doing that due diligence of really asking, like, when they receive a seed in their seed bank, or perhaps if you were to go to a seed swap or receive a seed through a seed company, a seed company oftentimes only has like a very short paragraph as to the origins of that seed. And if there is a curiousness, there's a lot of places you can go, whether it's to Seed Savers Exchange itself has a vast database of cultural memory around specific seed varieties. The yearbook itself has an amazing, it's just an enclave of amazing seed stories, those yearbooks. But I think just asking, who did whoever's gifting you the seed, where did they get it from? What cultural memory came along with those seeds, and just really making a commitment to ensure that, whatever stewardship chain or lineage or provenance that came with that seed, that you keep it with the seed as it sort of passes from your hands perhaps to other people. We are also developing a set of protocols through Indigenous Seed Keepers Network of like seed sharing protocols, mostly because there's a lot of fear and caution within Indigenous communities to share seed because of the patenting and genetic modification of seed. There's we're doing a lot of literacy work at the community level because people fear that perhaps their Indigenous traditional sacred seeds would be patented, whether it's a utility patent or used in a genetic modification project. And so we have developed some language that's sort of an offshoot or a spinoff of the open source seed initiative language. Again, we operate more in sort of a collective proprietorship or stewardship, as opposed to sort of the single breeder individual proprietorship that OSSI bases on. But on our seed packets that we produce for growers within our network, we actually have a specific language that's written on the tab of the seed packet that tells people that it's kind of a spin-off of the bag tag, which basically says that upon opening the seed packet, you are agreeing to not use this seed or any of its derivatives in any kind of patenting or proprietorship type situation. And so that's also creating some protection. We don't really know, like we really are a little bit in a defensive position as Indigenous peoples when we share seeds outward, of not exactly knowing sort of where they're going to go, but we do have to uphold our responsibility and our agreements to make sure that we are giving those seeds to trustworthy hands. So there's a lot of work there to be done.
I know we're coming close to the end of our time here, but I'm looking at the Q&A and I'm looking at the chat, and I just want to give voice to all of the thank yous that are pouring in, both from your keynote this morning and from your remarks here, that there's just a lot of gratitude being expressed for everything you're sharing.
Great. Wonderful. Do we have a couple more minutes? What's our time check?
I think we have exactly a couple.
Okay. I'm seeing this question here that's in the Q&A about, like, where would white farmers or settler farmers begin to start building relationships? I'd love to just speak to that. I think it's really, really important at the foundation of any intercultural work. I think the key is relationship building, is trust building. Like, we're doing that through our rematuration work. So I think looking, you know, in any kind of allyship situation, it's looking at what can you leverage, whether it's resources, sharing the mic. We as Indigenous peoples have a vibrant view of the future of food. We have blood memory that allows us to imagine what could be possible. I think, so, you know, starting with just building really positive relationships and trying to avoid sort of the saviorism of like, oh, charity and how can I help you, is just really centering the voices and decision making of those Indigenous peoples around you. And so it does start with land acknowledgement, but land acknowledgement is only as good as so far you sort of continue to build relationships with those people upon whose land you live. So ISKN is building bridges to help facilitate seed companies and farmers to build relationships with their Indigenous neighbors. But I think there's lots of ways in which you can uncover who are the First Nations people in your region, what sorts of initiatives, organizations, and entities do they have, and how can you begin to build those positive, mutually beneficial relationships that really center their needs. So you can check out our website too, nativefoodalliance.org. We do help facilitate a lot of those intercultural exchanges as well.